They mocked her when she unleashed frogs into the irrigation canals, until the land came back to life. Morgan Sterling was 36 years old and carried a stubbornness the whole family recognized, but never quite knew where it came from. Ever since her father fell ill and handed over the reins of the ranch to her 2.5 years earlier, she had made decisions no one expected, invested in ideas no one approved of, and lost entire nights of sleep over problems most people around her couldn't even see yet. But none of those decisions had caused as much uproar as that Thursday morning when she climbed down from an old dump truck with a makeshift plank and began releasing hundreds of frogs into the property's irrigation canals. The smell of soaked earth filled the damp air of that grey July morning, and the frogs hopped into the murky water one after another, with that wet, heavy sound echoing across the flat silence of the open plains. Morgan stood there, boots muddy up to her ankles, orange shirt stained with mud up to her elbows, her blonde hair tied up haphazardly at the nape of her neck with an old elastic band about to give out, guiding each frog down the metal plank with calm, deliberate movements, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Within an hour, the news spread through the rural community like wildfire. Mr. Vance's daughter had lost her mind. Neighbors stopped along the dirt road to watch from a distance, some laughing openly with their hands over their mouths, like someone trying to hide it but not putting much effort in. Others shaking their heads with pity, with that look of someone watching another dig in the wrong spot and not knowing how to warn them anymore. Far off in the plain, an old green tractor rumbled as it accelerated, and the man on it, Mr. Rowland from the neighboring property, looked away when Morgan lifted her head in his direction. It wasn't anger on that face. It was that kind of embarrassment from someone who doesn't want to be associated with an idea that everyone has already decided is crazy before even understanding what it's about. Morgan saw her neighbor's reaction. She felt the weight of the stairs stopping along the road. She heard, carried by the cold morning wind, the sound of some laughter that didn't bother to be discreet. But she didn't stop. Her hands kept working, guiding the plank, watching each frog disappear into the dark canal water, with that quiet determination of someone who has already made a decision and is no longer in a phase of doubt. She had spent weeks studying it, had talked for hours with the only man in the region who seemed to understand what she was trying to do, had lost sleep over doubts and woken up with more certainty than when she had lain down. And if there was one thing the years on the ranch had taught her, it was that the land doesn't care what people think. The land responds to what is done to it. Sterling Ranch had been built by Morgan's grandfather over decades of quiet work in a flat, hot region of the Midwest Plains, where the soil was the color of red clay and the irrigation canals were the difference between a bountiful harvest and a drought that swallowed everything. Her father, Mr. Vance Sterling, had inherited that land at 22 years old and spent the next 30 years shaping it in his own way, with a mix of physical strength, agricultural intuition, and a stubborn head that his daughter had clearly inherited. The ranch wasn't the biggest in the region, but it was productive, respected, and carried a name that meant something at the local farm bureau meetings, over-counter conversations at the general store, at the tables of weddings and baptisms that brought the community together. But that was before Mr. Vance fell ill. The trouble started with a backache he had been pushing aside for months, figuring it was from exertion, from age, from a lifetime of working under the sun without complaint, having learned not to pay attention to his own body. When he finally gave in to Mrs. Martha's relentless urging and went to see the town doctor, the diagnosis came with that heavy seriousness of specialists who know that what they're about to say will change a lot for a lot of people. There was no urgent need for hospitalization, but there were severe limitations. No physical exertion, no direct sun exposure, no carrying the emotional weight of managing a property that depended on quick decisions and hard work from dawn to dusk. Mr. Vance came back from the appointment quieter than usual. He sat on the porch with the coffee Mrs. Martha had left on the old wooden table and stared out at the fields for a length of time neither of them could measure. Bims. Martha stood beside him without saying a word. She knew that when Mr. Vance got like that, silent with the cup in his hand but not drinking, a decision was being made inside him, in a place words hadn't yet reached. It was after that he called Morgan. She was in a town up in the northern part of the state at the time, working for an agricultural planning firm that had lasted 3 years before starting to fall apart as the partners left. Her life there wasn't bad, but it wasn't what she had imagined when she left the ranch with her heart racing and her head full of plans. When the phone rang and she heard her father's voice for the first time in almost 2 months, she immediately sensed something different in his tone. Mr. Vance wasn't a man for preamble. He said what he had to say, the way he always did. Straight, without frills or drama, because drama was something he left for the soap opera Mrs. Martha watched after dinner. The next day, Morgan was in the car with her bags in the back seat and a coffee to go in her hand, driving back to the ranch she had sworn to herself she wouldn't return to so soon. She hadn't sworn that out of dislike. She had sworn it because the ranch had always been her father's territory, and coming back was in some way admitting she still needed ground. She hadn't been able to build on her own out there. But as she drove down the state highway, cutting through the open plains, with the flat landscape stretching as far as the eye could see, and the feeling that the sky was bigger there than anywhere else in the world, she let that pride settle at the bottom of her chest where it belonged, and she thought about her father with a tenderness that left no room for arguments. The first few months back were spent observing and listening. She walked the entire ranch with her father beside her, slowly, listening to every explanation about what had changed, every detail about the irrigation channels, the suppliers, the workers. Mr. Vance spoke with a mix of pride and concern that was hard to separate. Like 2 tangled threads, you can't pull one without moving the other. There were problems he hadn't admitted before. A pest infestation that had compromised the roots of 2 entire fields in the previous harvest, channels that were losing their ability to keep the water fresh and flowing, soil that had been treated with so many chemicals over the years that it had lost part of its natural structure without anyone noticing, because the results came slowly. Like a tide that rises so gradually you only notice when your feet are already wet. Morgan wrote it all down in a hardcover notebook that became her constant companion. She woke up before sunrise, stayed up late, and slowly learned to see the ranch not through her father's eyes but through her own. And what she saw was a land that was crying out for help in a way no one had stopped to hear. It was on one of those long afternoons of watching the irrigation channels that she first ran into Mr. Otis Leland. He was standing by the edge of the dirt road that separated Sterling Ranch from an abandoned property that had belonged to a family who had left the area many years ago. He had a straw hat on his head, an old notebook in his hand, and his eyes fixed on the water in the channel, with the kind of concentration of someone reading something that others don't know is written there. He was a man of average height, completely white hair, a thin beard, and dark eyes that had a habit of lingering too long on things, as if they needed more time than usual to decide what they felt. Morgan saw him there and thought it strange, because there was nothing obvious to justify that stop at that spot. "Are you lost?" she asked without hostility, but with that direct objectivity she herself didn't realize she had. He looked up at her calmly and pointed with the pen from his notebook toward the water. "This channel here has lost its oxygenation. See the color. See the foam that's sitting still at the edge. When the foam sits still like that, the water isn't flowing at the right pace. It's stagnating underneath, even if on the surface it still looks like it's moving." Morgan looked where he was pointing. The foam was there, indeed, sitting still, just as he said. She had seen that before, many times, but she hadn't connected that image to that explanation. "Who are you?" she asked. "Otis Leland. I was an agronomist for 40 years in this region. I retired about 6 years ago, but the habit of observing didn't retire with me. That was the first of many conversations." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. In the weeks that followed, Morgan and Mr. Otis developed a routine that neither of them had planned. She would show up late in the afternoons, when the sun began to go down, and the plains took on that copper color she had loved since she was a child, and the two of them would walk along the channels like someone visiting a person who is unwell and needs attention. He would talk, she would listen, he would point, she would take notes. And little by little, like pieces that fit together without force, the picture became clearer. "This soil was poisoned slowly," Mr. Otis said one afternoon, as he squeezed a handful of dark earth in the palm of his hand. "It didn't happen all at once. It was years of chemicals that killed what needed to be alive in here. Microorganisms, good larvae, everything the soil uses to regulate itself. When you take those elements away, the soil becomes dependent on the chemical, and then you need more and more chemical to get less and less result." "And what does the frog have to do with it?" Morgan asked, sitting on the edge of the channel with her notebook on her lap. He sat down on the ground beside her, with the ease of someone who isn't in a hurry and has no ego to protect. "The frog eats the insect that's destroying the roots of your crop, not the insect you see flying, but the one that's in the larval stage inside the water in the first few inches of moist soil. That's the insect compromising your roots from the very beginning. The chemical Mr. Vance used killed the insect, yes, but it also killed everything living around it. When you stop the chemical, the insect comes back first of all, because it's the most resistant. But if you put its natural predator back in the water, you create a balance the chemical never created." Morgan was silent for a moment, looking at the water. "And are you sure this will work on this soil, after so much chemical?" "I'm not sure of anything," he said without hesitating. "Certainty is something that sells well but delivers little. What I have is 40 years of observation that point in this direction. What will really happen, only the land knows." She liked the answer. It was honest in a way that certainties never are. While those conversations were happening on the channels, inside the main house of the ranch, another conversation was being prepared. Morgan knew something was coming when she saw Mitchell's car come through the gate on a Friday afternoon, without warning. Mitchell Hayes was married to Morgan's sister, Audrey, and had taken over the administrative and financial side of the ranch during the most critical period of Mr. Vance's illness, back when they still didn't know that Morgan would return. He was a man with broad shoulders and a quick way of speaking, the kind who never stayed still in a room and never understood when someone's silence was an answer. He called the meeting on the porch without actually calling it that. He simply showed up with a notebook, asked Mrs. Martha for coffee in a tone that made it sound like he was at home, and when Morgan came in from outside, still with her boots covered in mud, he said they needed to talk. "Have a seat, Morgan, don't bother taking off your boots." She sat down on the other side of the old wooden table, with her boots full of mud, just the same, and looked at him, waiting. "The ranch is in the red," he said, opening the notebook to a page full of numbers. "Not just today. For 3 years now. Only Mr. Vance didn't want to see it, and I was holding it together as best I could. Now it's reached a point where I can't hold it anymore." "How much?" she asked. "The operating debt, plus what's overdue with the suppliers, plus what's pending at the city bank, adds up to something that no longer fits in the cash flow this ranch generates." He turned the notebook for her to see. "There's an interested buyer. He's offered an amount that covers all of this and still leaves a reserve for Mr. Vance and Mrs. Martha to live comfortably for the rest of their lives." Morgan looked at the numbers. Then she looked at Mitchell's face. Then she looked back at the numbers. "Who's the buyer?" "An agribusinessman. His name is Harrison Brooks. He's already taken over other properties in the region. He has the structure to run a ranch this size. It's a real way out, Morgan, not giving up." She stayed silent for a time that Mitchell clearly hadn't expected. "I'm not signing anything," she said then, with that low voice that was more dangerous than if she had screamed. Mitchell's face changed. It wasn't a sudden change. It was that subtle shift of someone who was expecting one thing and got another. "Morgan, I understand it's hard to accept." "I'm not signing anything," she repeated with the same voice. "You can close the notebook." He closed the notebook slowly. He didn't say anything else that afternoon, but before he left, he gave her a look that lingered in the air long after the car disappeared down the dirt road. It was a look she recognized, the look of someone who doesn't accept the answer, but decides he'll wait for the right time to come back with it. The tension between Morgan and Mitchell went back to before her father's illness. It went back to when Mr. Vance, on a clear-headed day with no ceremony, had registered the ranch's title in his youngest daughter's name, and not in his oldest daughter's or his son-in-law's. He never publicly explained why, but those who knew Mr. Vance understood without needing an explanation. He had watched the two of them for many years and had come to a conclusion. Morgan carried the land in the way she looked at it. Mitchell carried the land in the way he calculated what it was worth. In the days following the meeting on the porch, Morgan felt that decision weighing on her in a way it hadn't before. It wasn't regret. It was the weight of understanding that she had chosen a path with no shortcuts. And then came the matter of the frogs. The idea had come up in one of the last conversations with Mr. Otis, when he explained that there was an old method, used in regions with soil characteristics similar to that one, which consisted of reintroducing native frog species into the irrigation channels. The frogs, by breeding in the canals, created a natural cycle of insect control that attacked the roots. The larvae became food, balance was restored, and the soil began to recover without the need for chemicals. It was slow. It took months. There was no guarantee of a perfect result. But it was the only path that didn't worsen the problem while trying to solve it. Morgan spent a week researching. She read articles from technical farm journals that Mr. Otis himself had brought from the old bookshelf in his house, a bookshelf that went from floor to ceiling and smelled of old paper and dry earth. She spoke with an agricultural technician from a nearby town who had worked with a similar method on a rice farm. She calculated what she would need, researched where to get the frogs, and one morning when the sky was still overcast and the ground was still cold from the night before, she got up, put on the orange shirt that was on the bedroom chair, pulled on her boots and went to the old pickup truck parked behind the shed. She took the metal ramp, adjusted the slope so the frogs would slide gently into the water, and began. That was the morning that changed everything. Not because the land changed that day, because the land is slow and doesn't change in a single morning, but because from that day on, everyone in the region knew there was a woman on that ranch who wasn't backing down, and the reaction to that was swift. 2 days later, the woman who worked at the local general store started telling customers that Morgan was destroying the canals with those creatures, that she would infect the water, that the neighboring properties would be affected. There was no technical basis for any of those claims, but technical basis was never what made gossip spread. The story grew with distance, as all stories do. The frogs turned into hundreds of alligators, the canals turned into an infested swamp, and Morgan turned into a woman who had collapsed under the pressure of the ranch. That was when Mrs. Eunice Taylor entered the scene. Mrs. Eunice had been the president of the local farm bureau for 7 years, a 63-year-old woman with short-cropped hair and a posture that left no doubt about who was in charge of any room she walked into. She called an informal meeting and sent word through 3 different people for Morgan to attend and explain what she was doing to the canals on the property. Morgan went. She brought her notebook, asked Mr. Otis to come along, and printed 3 articles from agricultural technical journals at the city's print shop, paying out of her own pocket because the ranch printer had been out of ink for 2 weeks. The Farm Bureau meeting room was full. There were growers from nearly every property in the region, some with curious expressions, many with closed-off expressions, and 1 or 2 people who were clearly there to watch the show and not to listen. Morgan stood in front of everyone and explained the method. She spoke objectively, without beating around the bush, without asking for permission to be heard. Mr. Otis stood beside her and added the technical points with the authority of someone who had spent 40 years in the field and didn't need to prove himself to anyone. The questions came right after they finished, and they were sharp. An older grower asked if she had any proof that it worked, or if she was experimenting on her father's ranch like it was a school lab. Another asked if she had consulted anyone with an active professional license, because a retired agronomist was different from an agronomist. And then Mrs. Eunice, with her firm voice and direct gaze that were her trademarks, asked the question that became the source of laughter in the room. "Do you intend to turn Sterling Ranch into a swamp?" The laughter came. Not a lot, but enough to fill the silence in a way that lingered heavily afterward. Morgan didn't lose her train of thought. He answered that a swamp was the result of neglect, not intention, and that what she was doing was the opposite of neglect. But words, no matter how true, have their limits when the room has already decided it doesn't want to listen. When she left that meeting, with Mr. Otis Leland by her side and the notebook under her arm, Morgan Sterling felt the weight of isolation fall onto her shoulders like cold rain. It wasn't the first time she had faced disapproval, but there was a difference between one person's disapproval and an entire room's disapproval. The first one hurts. The second one exhausts you. On the drive back, Mr. Otis Leland remained silent for a long time. Morgan drove unhurriedly, looking at the open plain stretching on both sides of the poorly paved road. "Do you think it was wrong to go?" she asked. "No," he said without hesitation. "It was necessary. There's a difference. And do you think anyone in there will change their mind?" He was silent for a moment before answering. "Maybe not tomorrow, but when the water in your canal starts to change, someone will remember what you said in that room, and then they'll want to have been on your side from the beginning." Morgan didn't reply, but she felt something small and stubborn settle inside her chest, in that place where doubt and determination lived together. 2 days later, Mr. Otis Leland called her over to his place to talk. He didn't usually do that. Normally they'd be out at the canals, walking, or on the ranch porch after the sun went down. This was the first time he had called her to his house, and when she arrived she noticed something different in his posture. He was sitting at the table, his hands resting on the wood, with that look that lingered too long on things, except this time the thing he was fixated on was her. "I have to tell you something," he said. "Before you find out some other way and think I kept it from you." Morgan sat down. "I already proposed this method to your father once, about 12 years ago, at a growers' meeting. Not exactly the same as what we're doing now, but the basis was the same. Reintroducing natural predators into the canals to control the pest without chemicals." She stared at him. "Your father listened to me for about 5 minutes, and then he said, in front of all the other growers, that it was an idea from an agronomist who had read a lot and worked little." Mr. Otis Leland paused. He didn't say it in a mean way. He said it in a way that made everyone laugh, and I left that meeting without answering, because there was no answer to that. The silence that settled in Mr. Otis Leland's small living room was different from the silence of the fields. It was a silence with sharp edges. Morgan sat still for a long moment, feeling the solid ground of certainty she had been walking on crack beneath her feet. It wasn't the method being questioned. It was the entire chain of trust she had built over the past few weeks. If her own father had humiliated that man, why had Mr. Otis Leland stood by her? Why had he walked into that meeting room and faced the sharp questions alongside her? Why had he shared 40 years of knowledge without asking for anything in return? "Why are you helping me?" she asked, and the question came out harsher than she intended. He didn't take offense. "Because what your father thought of me and what the land needs are two different things. I spent many years being proud enough to let a good idea die because of a humiliation. I'm old enough now to know that serves no one, not even me." She went back to the ranch earlier than planned that afternoon. She stayed in the kitchen for a while, doing nothing, just sitting at the table with her hands in her lap, her thoughts rearranging themselves. Mrs. Martha walked past the hallway and looked at her but didn't ask anything. A good mother knows when silence is what her child needs and when presence makes all the difference. It took 3 days for Morgan to go looking for Mr. Otis Leland again. When she did, she brought along an apology that wasn't hers, but she delivered it anyway, because she had learned that some debts are paid even when you didn't incur them, especially when the person who did is no longer in a position to pay. Mr. Otis Leland received the apology with the same calm with which he received almost everything. He only said that it was time to check the irrigation channels and that the afternoon was good for it, and the two went back to where they always went back, by the water's edge, with the notebook, silently observing what the land was doing. But while the channels waited, the ranch didn't stand still. Mitchell came back with the formalized proposal. This time, it wasn't a conversation on the porch. It was a visit to the accounting firm in town, where Clara Richards, the ranch's accountant for almost 15 years, had organized all the documents in blue folders laid out on the table as if she were preparing a defense, not quite sure which side she should be on. Morgan was called to the meeting 2 days in advance by Mitchell himself, with the formality of someone who had already decided the game was over. Businessman Harrison Brooks was also there. It was the first time Morgan saw him in person. She had a picture in her head, based on what she had heard about him, of a man who carried himself with calculated confidence, and he was exactly that. A jacket over his shirt, a firm handshake, a smile that stayed in the right place for the right amount of time. He had absorbed 3 smaller properties in the region over the last 2 years, according to what she had gathered from conversations here and there, and he had come to the area with an appetite that wasn't dwindling. "The proposal is here," Harrison said, sliding a folder across the table toward her. "It's fair, it's detailed, and it covers everything that's outstanding. I took the liberty of including a generous deadline for the family to organize their departure." Morgan opened the folder, scanned the numbers with that quick reading of someone who knows what they're looking for, and closed the folder without comment. "I'll think about it," she said. Harrison exchanged a look with Mitchell. A quick look, but Morgan saw it. It was the look of people who had agreed on something before the meeting and were confirming it was going according to plan. She left the office with the folder under her arm, as if taking it home to study, but inside she was processing a detail that had snagged in a corner of her mind. The way the two of them exchanged that look wasn't the look of people who had just met at a business meeting. It was the look of people who had talked before, a long time before. Confirmation came from where she least expected it. The following week, while waiting in line at the city bank to sort out a payment issue with the seed supplier, she overheard, unintentionally and without looking away, 2 men talking 2 spots ahead of her. They were farmers from another region whom she didn't know, and one of them was mentioning that he had dinner with Harrison Brooks and a farmer's son-in-law from the plains weeks before the ranch went into crisis. Mitchell's name wasn't said, but the farmer's son-in-law stuck in Morgan's mind like a hook that wouldn't let go. She kept that inside for 2 days without telling anyone. She kept going back over conversations with Mitchell, the documents she had seen, the meetings she had been called to. And the more she revisited, the more that piece that had felt wrong from the start started to take shape. It was then that Clara came to see her. It wasn't a call. It was an appearance. The accountant showed up at the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon without notice, her car parked outside the gate, as if she didn't want it to be too obvious that she had been there. Morgan Sterling received her on the porch, and Clara Richards sat on the edge of the chair, her purse in her lap and her eyes darting restlessly. "I brought something," she said, in that low voice of someone doing something she knows could cost her dearly. "I shouldn't be showing you this. Technically, I shouldn't, but I can't carry it around and stay quiet anymore." She opened her purse and pulled out a brown envelope, not very thick, and placed it on the table between them. "There are copies of accounting entries that don't add up, expenses that don't exist, payments to suppliers who never provided any service to this ranch, dates that are wrong in a way that isn't a typo." She paused. "This goes back to the time Mitchell was managing the finances." Morgan stared at the envelope for a moment without touching it. "Is Clara okay?" she asked, looking at the accountant. The question caught Clara off guard. She opened and closed her mouth once before answering. "I'm scared," she said simply, "but I'm more scared of not having said anything." Morgan picked up the envelope. She said she wouldn't expose Clara, and she kept that as a promise that didn't need to be sworn. That night, alone at the kitchen table with the envelope open and the papers spread out under the dim light of the lamp, Morgan went through each document carefully. It wasn't some soap opera investigation, full of obvious twists. It was something more unsettling. It was a story of small, steady embezzlement, done in a way that each isolated item could have a reasonable explanation, but together they formed a pattern that had no reasonable explanation at all. Maintenance expenses on equipment she knew hadn't been repaired, payment to a pesticide supplier on a date before that supplier even arrived in the region. Amounts that left with one service description and came back a few days later with a different one, as if someone was testing the system to see if anyone would notice. She closed the envelope at 2 in the morning and sat in the dark kitchen for a while, unable to go to sleep. The idea that the ranch's crisis had been fueled by someone on the inside, that the debts justifying the sale had been deliberately inflated, was a pain different from the other pains of that period. The other pains came from outside. This one came from within. The next morning she went straight to her father's room. Mr. Vance Sterling was sitting up in bed with the radio on low, listening to an oldies station he had discovered about 3 months ago and never let go of. He looked at her when she walked in, and something in his daughter's face made him turn off the radio without her having to ask. "Dad," she said, sitting down in the chair beside the bed, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "When haven't I been?" he said, in that hoarse voice that the illness had made deeper than before. "Mitchell. Did you always know what he was?" Mr. Vance was silent for a moment. It wasn't the silence of someone who didn't know. It was the silence of someone who had known for a long time and was just waiting for the right moment for someone to ask the question. "I knew he was the kind of man who puts profit before loyalty," he said at last, "and that's why I put the title in your name." Morgan felt her throat tighten. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because you would have left even sooner," he said, with that straightforward fatherly way of not lying, but not wrapping the truth in pretty paper either. "And I needed you to come when the time was right, not when I wanted it, when it was time." She looked at him for a moment, unsure whether there was anger or gratitude in that chest full of everything. She left the room without more questions. That afternoon she called Mitchell for a conversation on the porch. She placed the envelope on the table, open with the papers visible, and she stood there leaning against the doorframe, waiting. Mitchell stepped onto the porch with confident steps that lost a bit of speed when he saw the envelope. He stared at the papers for a moment, and Morgan watched the change in his face happen in slow motion. His jaw tightening, his shoulders lifting slightly, his eyes hardening. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "It doesn't matter where. What matters is what's in here." He was silent for a second, and then he let out everything he had bottled up since her father had put the land in her name and not his. "You don't understand business, Morgan. You never did. You spent a few years at a company that went under, came back thinking you know how to run a ranch, and now you think you have the right to question me. Your father made a mistake when he put this land in your name, and you're proving it every day with every decision you make." The words came like lashes, but they couldn't move her from where she was leaning. "You're going to leave this ranch," she said, in that low voice, "and it won't be with debt. It'll be with shame, which is worse." His face hardened in a way she had never seen before. He grabbed the keys from the table, walked past her without a word, and drove off with the tires scratching the dry dirt of the entrance. Morgan stood looking at the envelope on the table, the papers rustling in the wind that had blown in through the open porch. And then, with the same slow calm of someone who knows they still have a long way to go, she carefully folded each paper, put them back in the envelope, and tucked it into her pants pocket. When she got to the kitchen, Mrs. Martha was there, pretending to straighten up things that were already in order. The two women looked at each other, and her mother opened her arms without saying a word. And that's when Morgan cried, not out of defeat, not out of fear, but because of all that stuff she had piled up with nowhere to go that needed to come out before it got too heavy to carry. She cried for about 5 minutes. Then she washed her face in the cold stone sink, dried her hands on the edge of her mother's apron, and asked if there was any bread in the pantry, because she still hadn't had lunch. Mrs. Martha laughed, with that brief laugh that comes more from the eyes than the mouth, and she went to get the bread. In the days that followed, Morgan kept up her routine with the irrigation channels, as if the meeting with Mitchell and Clara's documents were a closed chapter waiting for the right moment to be reopened, not a fire still burning. She had learned from her father that the ranch doesn't stop for any family quarrel, and that stopping because you're angry is the surest way to end up where you don't want to be. And it was in that stubborn, silent routine that the first sign appeared. It was a Saturday afternoon, with that humid August heat that weighs more than it warms, when Mr. Zachary stopped beside her at the edge of the channel. He was the oldest worker on the ranch, a man of very few words and many years in the fields, with hands so calloused they seemed made of another material, and eyes that had seen so many planting and harvest cycles that they were in no hurry for anything. Usually he passed through the ranch without stopping, doing what he had to do with that silent efficiency of someone who knows every inch of the place. But that afternoon, he stopped. He stood next to Morgan looking at the channel for a moment, and then pointed to the water's surface with his rough finger. There were insect larvae floating dead in a stretch of the channel. Not many. But there were. He said nothing. He just nodded slowly, as if confirming to himself something he had suspected before. And he left. Morgan stared at that water for a long time after he was gone. Her heart was beating faster than usual, but she didn't let herself get carried away by emotion too quickly. She had learned from the ranch that a sign is a sign, not a certainty, that a step in the right direction is not the same as having arrived, but she also knew what it meant. She went to Mr. Otis Leland's house that same Saturday afternoon. He was on the porch, as he almost always was when she came by, with his little notebook in hand and a glass of water on his knee. She told him what Mr. Zachary had pointed out. He listened without hurry, without agitation, and then fell silent for a moment. "It's still too early to draw conclusions," he said, "but it's the first thing you'd expect to see if the method is working, the larvae being controlled before they reach the soil. How long until we have a clearer answer? 2 months, maybe 3. The land has its own rhythm and can't be rushed." Morgan went back home with that thought tucked away. She didn't tell Mrs. Martha, didn't tell her father. She held that small sign inside her chest, like an ember that needed care to not go out, but also didn't need too much wind to keep it from getting out of hand. But the ranch didn't wait for that care. The following week, Mitchell came back with a different strategy. He didn't go talk to Morgan, he went to talk to the workers. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now, continuing. The first to leave was Laercio, a 40-year-old man who had worked on the ranch for nearly a decade. He showed up early Monday morning with a closed-off face and said he couldn't stay. He gave no explanation, and Morgan didn't push. But when she carefully asked if there was anything she could do differently, he just said he'd received a better offer and needed to think about his family. He left that very day. Then came Ednaldo. Then Geraldo Filho. In less than 2 weeks, Morgan had lost 4 of the ranch's 7 permanent workers. Each departure was discreet, each excuse reasonable, but the pattern was clear. They had all received some kind of communication from a source that promised something better, but never specified exactly what. What remained were 3. Mr. Zachary, who was too old to move and too attached to the land to consider it. Mrs. Geraldine Foster, a 61-year-old woman who had come to the ranch many years ago as a day laborer and ended up staying permanently because the land had gotten into her in a way that doesn't leave. And a younger man named Thad, who had arrived a few months ago for temporary work and stayed because he simply hadn't gone back to where he came from. With 3 workers for a ranch that needed 7, Morgan began doing the work herself. She woke up earlier, went to bed later, ate lunch standing up, and there were nights she fell asleep at the table before finishing what was on her plate. The dark circles under her eyes deepened. Her hands grew more calloused than before. The bathroom mirror showed a face taking on that specific hardness of someone carrying more than they should, but with no one to hand off the extra load. Mrs. Martha saw all this in silence, with that motherly attention that doesn't ask but misses nothing. One morning before sunrise, she left a pot of stronger-than-usual coffee on the table with a note in her usual rounded handwriting. "You don't have to carry everything alone." Morgan read the note, folded it, put it in her pocket, and headed for the irrigation ditches. It was during this time of greatest exhaustion that Mrs. Geraldine showed up one morning with her daughter by her side. The daughter's name was Brooke Foster. She was 16, her hair tied in 2 braids, and had the manner of someone not used to staying still. Mrs. Geraldine introduced her in few words, as was her style. "She'll help on weekends, no pay, it's what I have to offer right now." Morgan wanted to say it wasn't necessary, that the girl had school, that it wasn't anyone's obligation. But Mrs. Geraldine cut her off before the words could come out. "It's not an obligation, it's a choice, there's a difference." Brooke started that very weekend. She worked with an energy that Morgan didn't realize she'd missed until it showed up, and that opened something up. The following week, a young man named Tyson showed up at the Sterling Ranch gate asking for work. He was 24 years old, had been let go from a neighboring property without explanation, and was looking for work at any ranch in the area. He had no connection to Mitchell, no connection to Harrison Brooks, and when Morgan asked why he had chosen to knock on that specific gate, he said that Mrs. Geraldine was a distant cousin of his mother and had mentioned the ranch was short on help. Tyson started the following Monday, and 2 days later, a third person arrived. A man in his 50s with a straw hat and the gait of someone who knows a ranch, who knocked on the door of the main house one afternoon and asked to speak to Mr. Vance's daughter. When Morgan went to answer, he introduced himself as Bennett Silver and said only that he had worked with her father many years ago before moving to another region, and that he had heard the ranch was struggling. He said he owed Mr. Vance a favor from a time that Mr. Vance himself had likely forgotten, and that he wanted to repay that favor the only way he knew how, with work. Morgan looked at him for a moment. "What favor?" she asked. "In a very bad drought year, when I was still a sharecropper on a small property. Your father lent me seed for free when there was no way to plant my share. He never asked for it back. Said he owed it to whoever had done the same for him before." Mr. Bennett paused. "I'm here to do the same." He started that very afternoon without a signed contract and without any further talk about it. With the arrival of the three, the ranch could breathe. Not deeply, not without effort, but it could breathe. The tasks were once again divided. Morgan managed to sleep a full night for the first time in almost a month, and the Canals, at that slow, stubborn pace only nature has, showed more. On one of Mr. Otis Leland's visits at the end of August, he stood by the edge of the main channel for a long time without speaking. Then he knelt down, put his hand in the water, and slowly pulled it out, looking at what was caught between his fingers. He smelled it. He kept his eyes closed for a second. "It's changing," he said. They were 2 words. But Morgan carried them for weeks. It was in that same week that Harrison Brooks returned to the ranch in person. He arrived in a large, dark vehicle, with a lawyer by his side who carried a thin folder and the demeanor of someone there as a witness, not a participant. Harrison introduced himself at the gate with his usual calculated cordiality, said a few weeks had passed, and that he'd like to know if Morgan had had time to think about the proposal. She received him on the porch with coffee and without smiles. While he spoke, she watched him. She watched his eyes, which had the habit of scanning the environment as they talked, as if they were assessing everything they saw. The eyes of someone who already considers it a done deal, who is in management mode for what they're about to receive and no longer in acquisition mode. There was arrogance in that, but it wasn't rude arrogance. It was the arrogance of someone who has been so successful so many times that they've forgotten what it's like not to be. When he finished speaking, Morgan said she needed more time. He placed the contract on the table with a smile that had the precision of a well-regulated clock. 2 weeks, he said. After that, the market could change and the offer goes with it. After the vehicle drove through the gate and the dust on the dirt road settled, Morgan stood on the porch for a moment with the contract in her hand. She didn't open it. She left it on the table and went inside. That night, Mrs. Martha came into her room with a small wooden box Morgan had never seen before. It was tiny, the wood darkened by time, with a rusty lock that no longer worked. Her mother placed it on the bed beside her and stood there, hands clasped in front of her. "This was your maternal grandfather's," she said. "Your father asked me to keep it when he got sick. He said there was a right time to open it. I think that time is now." Morgan opened the little box. Inside was a bundle of yellowed letters, tied with a piece of twine that had faded from green to nearly white over the years. There was also a black and white photo of a young man standing before an open field, hat in hand, gazing at the horizon. Her maternal grandfather, whom she had never met because he passed away before she was born. Morgan picked up the first letter and began to read, with the lamp lit beside her bed. The story the letters told was one that had never reached her in full detail. Her maternal grandfather, named Ernest, had lost the land he inherited from his father during a time when debts grew faster than the harvest could keep up. There was a cousin involved, a signature given without reading it properly, a lawsuit that dragged on for years and cost more than the land was worth. But her grandfather had fought, not with noise, not with revenge, not with endless lawsuits and countersuits. He fought by working on other land, saving what he could, learning from his mistakes, and returning when he had something solid to offer. And he returned. The final letters, written in a steadier hand and a different tone, described the reconquest, not of the same land which had already been sold to someone else, but of new land in another region, which he built with his own hands. There was a line in one of the last letters that stuck with Morgan like a hook buried deep. "The land I lost taught me more than the land I had. Because when you have, you hold. When you lose and win again, you understand." She read all the letters until dawn, by the weak light of the lamp and the complete silence of the ranch around her. When she finished the last one, she sat still for a while without moving. And then she felt something settle inside her that had been floating since the beginning, the certainty that this land was worth every cost being demanded to keep it. It wasn't blind stubbornness, it was understood heritage. The next morning, Morgan went into town to find a lawyer. The office was small on the second floor of a building on the main street, with a worn metal sign outside and a secretary who answered the phone while motioning for her to wait. The lawyer, a man in his 40s named Mr. Roger, saw her shortly after, listened carefully to what she had to say, read the financial documents Clara had provided, and sat in silence for a moment after closing the envelope. "There's a foundation," he said. "It's not simple, it's not quick, and you'll need additional documentation that we still have to gather. But there's enough basis to contest any sale Mitchell might try to push through claiming urgency of debt, because part of that debt seems to have a suspicious origin." Morgan took a breath. "How long?" "To have a solid enough position to use formally, at least 2 months. To have a position that intimidates the other side without needing to go formal, maybe less." It was long, it was draining, but there was solid ground beneath it. And solid ground was all she needed to know existed. When she returned to the ranch that afternoon, she passed by the irrigation channels before entering the house. She stood there for a while, boots at the water's edge, listening to what the ranch had to say. And what she heard was silence, but a living silence. The sound of frogs along the banks, the sound of moving water, the sound of insects that still existed, but were fewer than they once had been. Professor Raymond Garrison arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday in September without much fanfare. He had been recommended by one of the agronomists who had contacted Mr. Otis Leland after a farmer from a neighboring area had visited the channels on the suggestion of a relative of Mrs. Geraldine Foster. He was a researcher from a state university, specializing in irrigation channel ecosystems, a thin man in his 50s with glasses and a large backpack, from which came equipment Morgan couldn't name. He spent the entire morning by the channels. He didn't talk much, didn't explain what he was doing at every moment, just collected, measured, and noted on a clipboard with that closed-off concentration of researchers who don't like to be interrupted mid-reading. Mr. Otis Leland accompanied the visit alongside Morgan, and both stayed available without interfering. At the end of the morning, when the sun was already high and hot, Professor Raymond stopped by the edge of the ranch's longest channel and stared at the water for a while. "How long ago did you start this process?" he asked, turning to Morgan. 2 months and a week." He nodded, as if confirming a calculation he had made internally. "What I'm seeing here is preliminary, and I need to process the samples before any formal statement. But what's visible to the naked eye is already relevant. The stagnation foam has decreased in sections, with a greater presence of frogs. There are signs of improved oxygenation in the water's coloring, and the number of insect larvae in the surface samples is lower than what I would expect to find in a channel with this history of product use." Morgan listened without interrupting. "Is that good?" she asked when he paused. "It's promising," he said, with the caution of researchers who dislike making promises they can't keep. "Significantly promising. The preliminary report will take about 3 weeks." He left with the samples in his large backpack and promised to return. 3 weeks later, on a Monday morning with the sun still low, the report arrived by mail and Morgan found it in the mailbox by the gate as she was heading out to the channels. She came in with it, placed it on the kitchen table and read it standing up. Standing because sitting seemed too slow for the pace of her heart. The report documented a 42% reduction in the insect larvae population in treated sections compared to reference samples collected from sections without intervention. Measurable improvement in the water oxygenation rate in 2 of the 3 main channels. The beginning of beneficial microorganism recolonization in the channel sediment, indicating that the ecosystem was responding to the stimulus. Morgan read that part 3 times in a row. Then she closed the report, stood up, walked to the kitchen window, and stared at the fields with the sun breaking the flat horizon in the distance. Mrs. Martha came into the kitchen with the kettle in her hand and saw her daughter standing at the window. She set the kettle on the stove and stood beside her without asking. "The land is responding," Morgan said, her voice different. It wasn't exaggerated emotion. It was deep relief, the relief of someone who had pushed to the limit and found that the limit was farther than she had imagined. Mrs. Martha placed her hand on her daughter's arm. And the 2 of them stood there, mother and daughter, looking at the fields that had belonged to the grandfather, that had belonged to the father, and that now belonged to a woman who had released frogs into a canal and endured the laughter of an entire region without budging an inch from the direction she had chosen. That week, the crop that had been replanted at the start of the process showed more consistent sprouts than any other from the previous cycle. They weren't spectacular sprouts. They were solid sprouts, the kind that promise roots and not just looks. Mr. Zachary passed by the newest row one afternoon and stopped for a moment, looking at the new plants. Then he continued on without saying a word. But Morgan saw the slight nod of his head, and she knew what it meant. The article came out small. It was a half-page column in a technical farm journal with regional circulation aimed at rural producers, written by a journalist who had heard about the case through a colleague of Professor Raymond's. The title was modest. The photo was of the canals taken by the researcher himself, and the text was objective without exaggeration, describing the experiment on a ranch in the Midwest Plains that had chosen to reintroduce natural predators into the irrigation canals instead of deepening the use of chemicals. Morgan read the article 3 times and placed the journal on the table without much fanfare. But the effect the article had was disproportionate to its size. 2 days later, Mr. Otis Leland received a phone call from an agronomist from another region who had read the article and wanted to better understand the method. The following week, 2 more came. One from a city in the eastern part of the state, another from a family farming region 4 hours away. Professor Raymond was mentioned in the phone calls as a reference, and he started receiving questions from colleagues who had seen the report that had circulated in the academic network. The local community, which had decided that Morgan was crazy that grey July morning, began to hear from outsiders that perhaps that woman wasn't what she had seemed at first glance. And then Harrison Brooks withdrew the proposal. The letter arrived through his lawyer's office, formal and brief. Due to a change in the criteria for analyzing the project's feasibility, the acquisition proposal was being withdrawn. There were no thanks, no opening for future negotiation, nothing that seemed like a door left ajar. It was a clean and definitive retreat. Mr. Roger called Morgan as soon as he received the letter. "He's out," the lawyer said. "I know," she replied, not because she had predicted it, but because she had noticed a few days earlier, when Harrison's representative had passed through the region for a reassessment visit and left 2 hours later without talking to anyone from the ranch. When a confident investor makes a reassessment visit and leaves quickly, it's usually because he's reached a conclusion that wasn't in his plans. The ranch had ceased to be easy prey, and Harrison Brooks, like all of his kind, had no time to waste on what isn't easy. Missing, however, was Mitchell. Mitchell stayed silent for nearly 2 weeks after the businessman withdrew the proposal. Morgan knew he was calculating. She had learned over the years of living together that he never reacted immediately. He waited, observed, and then chose his angle. It was a trait she had admired before she understood where it pointed when interests were in conflict. The angle he chose was that of family. He called a formal meeting at the ranch house, the last one he would ever call in that space, and came accompanied by Audrey Sterling, who arrived with a closed face and eyes that had clearly gone without sleep. Morgan Sterling's older sister had remained silent throughout that entire period, a silence that was clearly costly for her, torn between her husband and her family. Morgan felt the weight of it when the two of them exchanged glances at the entrance, and she also felt how that was the only cost of all of this that truly ached in a different way, the cost being exacted from someone she loved. Mitchell had organized the meeting to present a final argument, and the final argument was her father. Mr. Vance Sterling was brought out to the porch in a wheelchair that had become necessary in recent weeks because his legs had lost too much strength for the long distances inside the house. He was placed there with the care and gentleness that his condition required, with a blanket over his knees and the radio turned off for the first time in many days. Mitchell began speaking as soon as everyone was seated. He said that the ranch's debts needed to be paid off somehow. He said that her father had suffered greatly from the pressure of it all and deserved his final years in peace, without worry. He said that Morgan's stubbornness had driven away a real solution. He said, with his voice growing more serious near the end, that keeping the ranch this way was a decision made by someone who thought more of herself than of her family. Each word landed on the porch with calculated weight. Morgan remained silent throughout, her hands on the table and her eyes on her father. She was no longer listening to Mitchell. She was watching her father. Mr. Vance was looking at his daughter, not at Mitchell, who had called the meeting, not at the ledger of numbers on the table. He was looking at Morgan with those tired eyes that the illness had made deeper, but which had not lost the clarity that had always been his hallmark. When Mitchell finished speaking, there was a silence that lasted longer than anyone expected. And then Mr. Vance spoke with the hoarse, slow voice that remained after everything, but with that thread of firmness that had never fully disappeared. The land is hers to decide. They were 5 words. 5 words from a man who had far less left of himself than before, spoken with everything that still remained, and they settled on the porch with a different weight than everything Mitchell had said before, because they were not words of argument. They were a father's words. Mitchell fell silent. It was the first time in all those months that he had been completely at a loss for a response. Audrey, beside him, looked away toward the garden, her chin trembling slightly, and Morgan felt her throat tighten at seeing her sister like that, because she understood what that moment was costing her as well. The meeting ended without a formal resolution that day, but from then on Mitchell called no more meetings. The decision about what to do with what Clara had revealed came slowly, after much conversation with her mother and with Mr. Roger, and after a whole night awake, thinking not of herself but of the consequences for the family, specifically for Audrey, who had done nothing wrong except marry a man she herself had come to not fully know. Morgan did not pursue formal legal action, but she did move forward with a document, Mr. Roger drafted a term that was neither accusatory nor forgiving. It was a formal agreement, with legal recognition, that removed Mitchell from any role in financial or administrative decisions related to Sterling Ranch, effective immediately and with no possibility of future revision without Morgan's consent. There was a clause that did not explicitly say what had been discovered, but that Mitchell would be able to read between the lines. The lawyer delivered the document to Mitchell on a weekday morning, without Morgan present. Mitchell signed it the same day. When Mr. Roger called to confirm the signature, Morgan was out in the irrigation channels, boots deep in the mud, and took the news with the phone pressed to her ear, while watching a frog leap off a rock and vanish among the water plants that had started growing along the banks with a new, tentative shyness, which was, in itself, a sign. "He signed," the lawyer said. "I know," she replied. Not because she had foreseen it, but because there was something about that moment that made sense in a way she couldn't put into words. Like when the rain you've been waiting for finally arrives, and you're not surprised, but you stand there listening anyway. That afternoon, Mitchell left the ranch with the last of his things from the office. He passed by the porch without stopping, loaded a box into the back seat of his car, and drove off. The iron gate creaked as it closed, that rusty sound the ranch had never bothered to fix because there were always more urgent things to tend to. The sound echoed for a moment in the silence of the afternoon. Morgan was at the living room window when he left. She kept watching until the car disappeared around the bend of the dirt road. Mrs. Martha was beside her, a dish towel in her hands that she'd stopped folding when the car pulled away. The two stood there in silence, mother and daughter, watching the dust settle. "Will Audrey be okay?" Morgan asked without looking at her mother. "Audrey will be fine," Mrs. Martha said, with that certainty of someone who knows her daughters better than they think. "She's her mother's daughter. She'll be fine." In the days that followed, Morgan called her sister. The first conversation was difficult and short. The second was longer. The third lasted nearly an hour and a half, and when it ended, neither had resolved everything. But both had said what needed to be said and heard what needed to be heard. It was enough for now. The rest would come with time, which is how real things always come. Mrs. Eunice Taylor showed up at the ranch on an October afternoon, unannounced. Morgan was in the irrigation channels when she heard she'd arrived and went to meet her with her boots still soaking wet. The president of the local farm bureau, standing at the edge of the dirt road that ran parallel to the main channel, wore a sun hat and looked at the water with an expression different from the one she'd worn at the meeting months ago. There was no suspicion on that face. There was perhaps the quiet effort of someone trying to understand something she had decided she didn't understand before she'd even tried. "I wanted to see," Mrs. Eunice said, as if that were explanation enough. Morgan called Mr. Otis Leland, who came with his hat on and his little notebook in hand, as always. The three of them walked along the channels for nearly 2 hours. Mr. Otis explained, pointed things out, showed the signs the water was giving. Mrs. Eunice listened without interrupting, which in itself was something Morgan hadn't expected, because Mrs. Eunice was known for never listening in silence when there was something to comment on. At the end of the walk, standing at the edge of the longest channel, Mrs. Eunice was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Would there be a possibility of you presenting this at the next Farm Bureau meeting?" It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a formal admission that she had been wrong. But Morgan understood what that question carried, because she had spent enough time among folks from the plains to know that when someone who had doubted you asks you to present your work in front of everyone, it's because that someone is saying in the only way they know that they were wrong. "With pleasure," Morgan said. And she meant it. That night, sitting on the porch with a tea that Mrs. Martha had left on the little wicker table beside her chair, Morgan stared out at the fields in the dark. The sky was wide open and full of stars, with that abundance of stars that only exists far from the cities, and the sound coming from the plains was the sound of frogs, more present than before, singing in the canals with that constancy that is in no hurry to get anywhere. Her father had asked to sit on the porch earlier, and had stayed there for a while, listening to the radio with the volume low. Before heading back to his room, he had placed his hand on his daughter's shoulder, once, without speaking. And that small gesture had said more than any speech. Morgan stayed on the porch until late, alone, listening to the frogs and thinking about everything it had cost to get here. The neighbors' laughter, the meeting with the sharp questions, the sleepless nights, the workers who had left, the papers on the kitchen table, her grandfather's letters she had read until dawn, Mitchell's closed face as he left through the gate, and her sister's face trying to stay whole through all of it. No cost had been cheap, but none had been unnecessary. The next morning, with the sun breaking the flat horizon of the plains, with that burnt orange color she had loved since childhood, Morgan walked down to the canals alone. She was still wearing the boots from the night before, which she had left by the entrance. She walked slowly along the water's edge, listening to the damp ground give slightly under the weight of her steps. The water reflected the light differently than it had 4 months ago, more alive, less murky, with that broken mirror quality that good water has when it's truly moving. The aquatic plants that had begun to grow along the banks were denser, with that dark green color of something with deep roots. A frog jumped off a rock as she approached, and disappeared among the broad leaves covering the bank. She stopped. She stood there for a while, boots in the mud, listening. There was no noisy victory. There was no audience, no speech, no moment of arrival that stories usually invent to make the ending make sense. There was only the land responding, at its own pace, stubborn and resilient, like someone who had cared for it through those months. There was the sound of the frogs. There was the sound of the water. There was the sound of the wind in the new plants along the banks. And there was inside Morgan That specific feeling of someone who had done something difficult the right way and survived to see the result. Not the feeling of someone who won a war, but the feeling of someone who understood that the war was never the point. The point was always the land. The point was always what remains after the noise passes. She stayed there for a long while. Then, when the sun was high enough to warm her shoulders through the orange shirt she had put on that morning without thinking it was the same color as that July morning when everything had begun, she turned and walked back to the house. She had work to do. End of story. Tell us what you thought of this story. Leave a comment with what moved you the most. Hit like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories coming your way.